In 1952, Enzo Ferrari stood at a crossroads. His racing team had just achieved something no Italian manufacturer had accomplished in the modern era. They had vanquished the supercharged Alfa Romeo, the dominant force in Formula One racing. With victories piling up and his name written across the championship standings, Enzo had proven that Ferrari was no longer an underdog. He was a titan. Yet despite this European glory, his greatest ambition remained unfulfilled. He had not conquered America. The United States represented the world's most lucrative automobile market, a land of unlimited wealth and endless possibility. It was a market that Ferrari, with its hand-built masterpieces and six-cylinder passion, could dominate if given the chance. But first, there was a prize that demanded attention: the Indianapolis 500-mile race. In the bizarre calculus of international motorsport governance, the Indy 500 had been included in the Formula One World Championship in 1950. This made it fair game, and to Enzo, it made it a target. He decided that the Ferrari 375, the magnificent naturally aspirated V12 that had just defeated Alfa Romeo in Europe, would be the instrument of his American conquest. It did not go as planned. 4 Ferraris would arrive at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in May of 1952. Only one would qualify. Ascari would drive it magnificently. He would still fail. Today, the Ferrari 375 Indy sits in museums, a forgotten footnote in automotive history, a reminder that sometimes even genius cannot overcome geography and circumstance. This is the story of Maranello's lost American dream. To understand why Enzo Ferrari was willing to gamble on Indianapolis, you must first understand what the Ferrari 375 represented in 1951 and 1952. The car was born from desperation and refined through brilliance. Just a few years earlier, Ferrari had been struggling. The company's small, supercharged V12 engines, designed by the legendary Gioacchino Colombo, had proven unable to match the raw horsepower of Alfa Romeo's supercharged machines. Ferrari's drivers were quick, its engineering was sound, but it was simply not fast enough. In 1949, Enzo made a fateful decision. He brought on a new technical director named Aurelio Lampredi, a man with a radically different philosophy. Where Colombo had believed in small displacement and forced induction, Lampredi believed in natural aspiration and displacement. He proposed building an entirely new V12 engine, starting from scratch, with a bore and stroke designed for a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated configuration. The engine would be simple compared to its supercharged rivals, featuring just 2 valves per cylinder operated by a single overhead camshaft in each cylinder bank. But that simplicity concealed sophistication. The engine was not just bigger, it was designed with a completely different power curve. The Colombo engine screamed at high RPM but lacked torque. The Lampredi engine pulled strongly from low revolutions and maintained power across a broad RPM range. It was an entirely new philosophy applied to racing. By 1951, this philosophy had proven itself correct. The 375 F1, as it was designated, made its debut at Monza in September of 1950 and immediately showed promise. Alberto Ascari, Ferrari's star driver, qualified second and was running competitively until engine troubles forced him to hand over his car to teammate Dorino Serafini, who managed to bring it home in second place. It was merely a preview of what was coming. In 1951, the 375 would claim Ferrari's first Formula One World Championship victory at Silverstone, when José Froilán González utterly dominated Juan Manuel Fangio's Alfa Romeo, winning by nearly a minute. Ascari would win 3 more races that season, cementing Ferrari's status as the new king of Formula One. The engine had proven itself capable, efficient, and reliable in ways the old Colombo simply could not match. By 1952, with Alfa Romeo out of racing and the Formula One regulations about to change to require smaller 2.5-liter engines, the 375 was approaching the end of its career in European racing. But that end could be spectacular. Enzo and his American importer, Luigi Chinetti, had a plan. If the 375 was good enough to win in Europe, surely it was good enough to win in America, specifically at Indianapolis. Enzo himself had never crossed the Atlantic, but he understood through careful study that American racing was different. The cars were lower, more nimble for the short turns of European circuits. The engines were often smaller, more efficient, more delicate. But at Indianapolis, everything was different. American cars were built to run flat out for 200 miles on a high-speed oval, corner after corner after corner. The tracks were banked steeply. The speeds were relentless. The physics were brutal. Enzo believed the 375's raw power and mechanical reliability could overcome these obstacles. After all, it had overcome every obstacle placed before it in Europe. 4 Ferraris were prepared. They were based on the 375 F1, but extensively modified for American racing. The chassis was lengthened to improve stability at sustained speeds. The wheelbase increased by over 2 feet compared to the F1 version. The suspension and frame were strengthened to handle the brutal loads of oval racing. The engine received 3 new Weber carburetors, upgraded from the dual choke units used in Europe. Power output climbed from 350 horsepower to 380 horsepower. The cars weighed only 785 kilograms, less than 1,700 pounds, extraordinarily light by any standard. These machines represented the pinnacle of Italian racing engineering. They represented Enzo's confidence that Ferrari could succeed anywhere. They represented his ambition to plant the prancing horse on American soil and declare it master. Yet from the moment the 4 Ferraris arrived at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in May 1952, something felt wrong. The paddock at Indianapolis was utterly foreign to the Italian engineers and mechanics. The American roadsters looked crude by comparison. Wooden frames, open cockpits, stubby rear ends. But they were built to a specific purpose by men who understood exactly what would work at this particular circuit. The Offenhauser 4-cylinder engines that powered most of these roadsters were relatively small in displacement, usually 270 cubic inches, about 4.4 liters. But they were tuned to an incredible finesse by specialists who had spent decades perfecting them. They were not powerful on paper, but they were perfectly adapted to Indianapolis. The Ferrari 375 generated 380 horsepower, significantly more power than the Offenhauser. But horsepower is just part of the equation. The Ferrari had been designed for road courses with constant direction changes, braking, and acceleration. Indianapolis demanded something different. The oval required the car to turn left for 200 miles without significant changes in driving technique. The physics were unforgiving. The tires used at Indianapolis were different from European racing tires. The Firestone compounds used at the speedway were designed for sustained high-speed cornering on a flat oval, quite different from the European racing compounds. The Ferrari needed European tires for proper setup, but American regulations demanded American tires. The suspension setup that worked in Europe did not work here. The gear ratios that delivered victory at Monza left the Ferrari vulnerable here. The wire-spoke wheels that were standard on the Ferrari, while beautiful and traditional, were also fragile compared to the magnesium wheels that American teams were increasingly using. The Italian engineers were warned repeatedly by American competitors to switch to magnesium wheels, to use American tires, to modify the suspension extensively. But Ferrari was confident in its engineering. They believed the fundamental superiority of their machine would overcome these obstacles. Alberto Ascari was the driver assigned to the works Ferrari. He was Ferrari's top driver, the man who had just won 3 Grand Prix races and was leading the championship charge. He was a 2-time world champion in waiting. If anyone could tame the Indianapolis Challenge, it would be Ascari. But even Ascari would struggle. In practice, the car never felt quite right. It was too heavy for the turns. It lacked the responsive steering the American cars possessed. The engine, while powerful, generated power in a different part of the RPM range than was ideal for Indianapolis's constant speed cornering. The gearbox needed to be used more than the American drivers needed to use theirs. Ascari would have to be more aggressive with gear changes, braking, and acceleration to compensate for the car's fundamental incompatibility with the circuit. During the first qualifying weekend, Ascari made a shocking discovery. No amount of fine-tuning could overcome the basic engineering philosophy difference between the Ferrari and its American rivals. The qualifying runs showed that the car, while fast in absolute terms, was not fast enough to be competitive in the context of the other machines on the circuit. The Ferrari struggled with sustained corner speed. Where an Offenhauser-powered roadster could flow through a corner and maintain throttle position, the Ferrari needed to be manipulated, shifted, braked, managed. Ascari was masterful in his attempt, but the car's engineering simply could not deliver the smooth efficiency that won races at Indianapolis. During the second qualifying weekend, a dramatic moment revealed just how much Ferrari was struggling. The team had realized that the fuel and carburetor system was not optimized. A manifold specifically designed for Indianapolis conditions had been shipped from Italy, but in a comedy of errors, it had been sent to St. Louis instead of Indianapolis. The package was eventually located and rushed to the track, but when it arrived and was installed on Ascari's car, the tall intake structure no longer fit under the bonnet. The mechanics had to modify the hood, cutting it away to accommodate the taller carburetor stack. It was a band-aid on a fundamental problem. The real issue was not the carburetor. The real issue was that the Ferrari was not a car built for this place and this race. Still, Ascari qualified. On May 24, 1952, he coaxed the Ferrari to an average speed of 134.308 miles per hour over 4 qualifying laps, earning him 25th position on the starting grid. It was the only Ferrari that qualified from the 4 entered. The 3 customer cars, driven by Johnny Parsons, Bobby Ball, and Johnny Morrow, could not find the speed. Parsons, a previous Indianapolis 500 winner, felt so little support from Ferrari and so little confidence in the car that he walked away during qualifying. He moved to another team and drove a traditional Curtis-Offey roadster, eventually finishing 10th. For Parsons, it was not a matter of ability. Parsons was a consummate professional. It was simply that he understood immediately what the Ferrari engineers were only beginning to recognize. The car was fundamentally unsuited to this circuit. On race day, May 30, 1952, Ascari showed exactly what a masterful driver could do with an unsuitable machine. From the 25th position on the starting grid, he drove with surgical precision, climbing through the field lap after lap. His consistency was remarkable. The time difference between his fastest and slowest laps during qualifying had been only 0.08 seconds, an extraordinary feat that demonstrated his complete control of the machine. He was running as high as 8th place by lap 30, actually battling for real positions against the American roadsters. The crowd was impressed. The Italian driver was winning over the fans at the Brickyard with his aggressive, talented driving. The railbirds, the fans who lined the guardrails, appreciated what they were seeing, a masterful demonstration of driving skill. But Ascari knew, and his team knew, that the car was not going to win. They had hoped merely to finish respectably, to prove that Ferrari could survive 200 miles at Indianapolis. That alone would have been a moral victory. They had planned a race strategy running below 6,400 RPM, with 2 planned pit stops for fuel and tires, designed to conserve the car's mechanical condition and complete the race. But lap 40 changed everything. As Ascari drove through turn 3 on the backstretch, something catastrophic happened. The rear wheel, stressed beyond its design envelope by the brutal loads of continuous left-turn cornering, suddenly collapsed. Not failed gradually, but catastrophically collapsed. The wire spokes, which had served Ferrari superbly on European circuits for years, simply could not handle the sustained, relentless pounding of an American oval at speed. The right rear wheel bearing froze. The differential allowed the wheel to slip rather than lock the axle. The spokes tore away from the hub. The car spun violently. Ascari was thrown backward in the cockpit, completely disoriented. The Ferrari came to rest in the infield. Ascari was uninjured, but the machine was done. He was classified 31st out of the 33 cars, having completed just 40 of the 200 laps. The single Ferrari that had qualified had failed to finish. The great experiment was over. What made the failure particularly galling was the context of what was happening elsewhere in the 1952 championship. While Ascari was failing to finish at Indianapolis, he was about to embark on an extraordinary run through the remaining 6 Grand Prix races of the season. He would win them all. He would claim the World Championship with an unprecedented margin of victory, proving that his skill was not in question. The only World Championship race in 1952 that Ascari entered and failed to finish was the Indianapolis 500. It remained unfinished business, a hole in an otherwise perfect record. Enzo Ferrari, observing from Italy, understood that the experiment had failed. It was not a failure of engineering in an absolute sense. The Ferrari 375 was a magnificent racing engine. It was not a failure of driving talent. Ascari was one of the greatest drivers of all time. It was a failure of adaptation. The car was built for a different type of racing. The oval, the physics, the materials, the tire compounds, all of it was fundamentally different from what Ferrari knew. The American teams, by contrast, had developed their machines through years of experience at this particular circuit. They understood the tolerances. They knew what materials would hold up. They had developed suspension geometries that worked for continuous left-hand cornering. The Ferrari's superior power and engineering could not overcome these accumulated years of specific circuit knowledge. 3 customer cars had also been entered at Indianapolis. One was driven by Bobby Ball, entered by the Howard Keck Special. Another was the Grant Piston Ring Special, originally intended for Johnny Parsons, but driven by Danny Oakes after Parsons defected. The third was entered by Johnny Mauro. None of them qualified. Ball managed to run the car, but it never reached qualifying speed. Oakes, driving the Grant car, couldn't push the machine hard enough to break into the field. Mauro's car likewise failed to qualify. Even with 3 different drivers and 3 different team setups, the Ferrari simply could not match the specific requirements of Indianapolis qualifying. Parsons' defection was particularly telling. Here was a man who had won the Indianapolis 500 in 1950 driving a traditional American roadster. He understood the circuit intimately. When he got behind the wheel of the Grant Ferrari and felt how it handled, he recognized immediately that it was not a competitive machine for this place. So he walked away, even when substantial money was offered to stay. He understood that trying to qualify with an unsuitable machine was a waste of time and talent. The failure of the 3 customer cars demonstrated something crucial. This was not a matter of the factory team having better resources or better drivers. The problem was fundamental. The car itself was unsuitable. After 1952, Ferrari never returned to Indianapolis with a factory entry. It was a decision that reflected both strategic recognition and practical limitation. Enzo understood that competitive success at Indianapolis would require a complete redesign, not just incremental modifications. The 375 had been designed for European racing. Adapting it for American oval racing would require changing almost everything: the suspension geometry, the engine tuning, the fuel system, the gearbox ratios, everything. It would essentially require designing an entirely new car. Enzo was unwilling to commit that level of resources to a single race, no matter how prestigious. His attention was increasingly focused on other forms of racing. Formula One continued to demand attention and resources. The sports car racing that had produced Ferrari's first victory at Le Mans in 1954 was becoming increasingly important. The Mille Miglia, the Targa Florio, the Carrera Panamericana, these were races where Ferrari's machines could compete with success. Indianapolis required a different type of automotive culture, different materials science, different manufacturing capabilities. It required, in essence, an Americanization of Ferrari that Enzo was not willing to pursue. The American importer Luigi Chinetti would continue to champion Ferrari's cause in the United States, creating the Ferrari America Series specifically for the American market. But Indianapolis as a race venue would remain closed to Ferrari's ambitions. The story might have ended there, but there was an epilogue, one that remained unknown to most of the racing world for decades. In 1954, 2 years after the failure at Indianapolis, Ferrari began work on a new Indianapolis prototype, codenamed the 375 Monoposto Corsa Indianapolis. It was a completely fresh design, built ground up specifically for the race. Aurelio Lampredi, the brilliant engineer who had created the original 375 engine, was involved in this new project. A new chassis was designed. The car was built in Italy, prepared, tested. Everything was ready. But it was never raced. The car was sold to Luigi Chinetti, Ferrari's American importer, and it was presented at the New York Motorsports Show in January 1955. There it sat, displayed alongside the new Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, while the automotive press marveled at Stuttgart's engineering. The Ferrari garnered attention, but the Mercedes was the sensation of the show. More importantly, by 1955, the momentum for another Indianapolis attempt had simply evaporated. Chinetti was occupied with other matters. Ferrari's factory had its hands full with the escalating sports car racing program. The prototype chassis 0388 would never see a competitive lap at Indianapolis. It would eventually be restored and shown at Ferrari events decades later, tantalizing observers with what might have been. But even that was not the end of the story. In 1986, when the FIA was trying to enforce a budget cap on Formula One teams, Enzo Ferrari made a dramatic threat. He was considering withdrawing from Formula One and entering IndyCar racing instead. To prove his seriousness, he authorized the construction of a completely new IndyCar prototype, the Ferrari 637. It was designed by Pininfarina and built with a V12 engine capable of remarkable power output. Enzo even arranged a secret meeting with FIA officials at the Fiorano test track in Maranello. The new car was fired up, tested, shown to the horrified Formula One establishment. The message was clear: Ferrari could be somewhere else if its requirements were not met. It was a brilliant strategic maneuver, and it worked. The FIA capitulated, allowing larger engine displacements that favored Ferrari's V12s. The IndyCar project was quietly mothballed. The Ferrari 637 never raced. But for a moment in 1986, just as in 1952, Enzo was willing to gamble that Ferrari could conquer an American oval. And just as in 1952, the gamble never materialized into actual competition. Why does the Ferrari 375 Indy matter? Why, more than 70 years later, do we still tell this story? The answer lies in what it reveals about the fundamental nature of automotive design, engineering culture, and the relationship between technology and geography. The 375 was not a failure in any absolute sense. It was a magnificent machine, expertly engineered, powerful, reliable. It represented the cutting edge of Italian automotive design in 1952. Yet it failed at Indianapolis not because it was inferior, but because it was designed for a different purpose. The American oval racing world had developed its own technologies, its own materials science, its own design philosophy over decades of competition. The Ferrari's European engineering, while superior in many respects, could not simply be transplanted to a completely different environment. This is a humbling reminder that technical excellence in one domain does not guarantee success in another. It is also a reminder of how profoundly divided the automotive world was in the 1950s between American and European racing cultures. The gap has never been fully bridged. Every time a European Formula One team has attempted to compete in American racing formats, the same dynamics have repeated themselves. The machines designed for one type of racing do not simply work in another. The 375 Indy sits in museums today. One example is in the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum collection, as a beautifully preserved artifact of ambition and the limits of engineering. It represents Enzo Ferrari's only serious attempt to win the most famous race in American motorsport. It represents a moment when Maranello's legendary confidence met the brute reality of American oval racing and, for the first time and only time, came up short. The Brickyard's history is filled with stories of triumph and tragedy, of innovation and tradition, of American roadsters dominating the circuit for decade after decade. But buried in that history is the story of 4 red cars from Italy, driven by drivers of genuine talent, powered by engines of genuine power that could not adapt to an alien landscape. That story matters not because it ended in tragedy, but because it reveals something profound about the nature of automotive competition. Sometimes, even genius cannot overcome geography. Sometimes, the gap between two racing cultures is simply too wide to bridge in a single attempt. The Ferrari 375 Indy is Maranello's lost American dream, a reminder that even the greatest automotive companies cannot win every battle, and that the most famous race in the world is fundamentally an American race, built on American terms, for American machines. The 375 remains a beautiful, technically brilliant, deeply unsuitable reminder of that timeless truth.